Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
The Arctic is not an easy place to live. It's cold, obviously. In the depths of winter, the sun barely rises. Your favourite band is unlikely to tour. But you can at least count, or so you would reckon, on peace, quiet, and being generally left the heck alone. Not so fast. In the actual commercial and geostrategic senses, the Arctic is hotting up. These phenomena are related. As the ice recedes, new shipping lanes and hitherto untapped mineral deposits will become potentially accessible. Tensions between the NATO countries, which now number 7 of the 8 Arctic nations, and the other one, Russia, will be expressed in the establishment of new military installations and increased deployments of aircrafts, ships, submarines, and shivering soldiers wishing the Balearic Islands could become some sort of front line, or perhaps Tahiti. The most obvious, if most ridiculous, manifestation of this new reality is the recurrent threat by US President Donald Trump to expropriate Greenland, i.e. the territory of fellow NATO member Denmark. This is, to say the least, unhelpful. If the alliance is to mount a convincing deterrent to Russia getting any funny ideas in the high north, it is going to need all its forces pointing in the same direction. But it does illustrate the increasing importance of a region which has, for almost all of human history, been left pretty much to its own devices. What are the stakes in play in the Arctic? How can it be better defended? And what will all this mean for the people who actually live there? This is the Foreign Desk.
There's the intersection of climate and tradition and culture, but there's also the inflection of Western influence.
And of course now the threats are moving closer to home with cable cuts, shadow fleets. So now we have to fight on multiple fronts.
Even though we wouldn't like to necessarily securitize the Arctic, make it more military, I think that's what's happening at any rate. So I think we just have to make sure that our interests in our region is being protected.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Sebastian Copeland, an award-winning photographer and polar explorer who has spent his career documenting the changing landscape of the region. Sebastian, first of all, we have the disadvantage in talking to a photographer that this is an entirely audio medium. So our listeners should, of course, go and look at your pictures as soon as they're done listening to this. But we were hoping you could talk us through a sense of what it's actually like being in the Arctic. What do you see and hear and smell? And how would you sum the experience up?
Well, I think the experience is what happens in nature when we're not looking. And that especially applies to how this went on for about 4.6 billion years, that is, before we started to populate the planet. Depending on the timeline, anatomically modern humans are 175,000 years old, but you could certainly time it to 3 million. Either way, it's a sliver of time relative to what happens in nature. And the Arctic and the polar regions in general are completely antagonistic to human life. I mean, it says a lot about humans that we can actually operate, travel, and to some extent enjoy it occasionally because it's just jolly cold. But it's ultimately what nature does. And we're just lucky to be able to exist in more moderate latitudes.
Is that what has kept you going back to it? The idea that this is, I guess, nature in excelsis, that this is the part of the planet that's really not meant for us?
Well, I think For me personally, it's just about discovering another world that's right here on our planet and in this biosphere. And it's the discovery of another environment that is akin to being, let's say, on another planet.
I mean, as you were describing earlier, it has been approaching its current state or developing its current state for long before we got here. But in the time you've been going there, which is obviously the meagrest fraction of that time, have you noticed it perceptibly changing? Does it look and feel different now to you than it did when you started going there?
Yeah, I mean, that's incontrovertible. We see it in a multitude of different dimensions. If you're in the Arctic as opposed to Antarctica, the Arctic's had human populations for in excess of 35,000 years, some say even 40,000 years, coming from Asia and populating first northern Canada and Alaska and then eventually making their way to Greenland. These populations, not having to go as far back as that, but just in the last few decades alone, have seen major transformations there, and they should know. The seasonal cycle of the melt and the freeze is lengthening in the melt season and shortening in the freeze season, and this affects their livelihood and their ability to maintain tradition and culture. So that's on the cultural side. On what you see and feel. And that is particularly true for the Arctic Sea, which is essentially a thin crust of ice that floats over the Arctic Ocean. That cycle, which I've just alluded to, is very, very tangible when you time your expeditions and you travel on it.
I mean, are you noticing it even in terms of at various times of year you have to wear less than you once did? Is it simply not as cold as it was?
Well, that certainly would be one element. Just to give you an idea, I've been going to northern Greenland, the very sort of northern end of it, and doing a study on the local populations. And the last 15 years or so, I've seen a non-linear, but nevertheless a very clear trend towards an earlier melt cycle. And this year in particular was 7 years ahead of trend. So the melt season happened, the sea ice disappeared in late May as opposed to late July.
But those people who live up there, though, and elsewhere in the Arctic, what sense have you been able to get of how nervous or otherwise they are about the future?
It's really nuanced, and that's partly this multidisciplinary work that I do up there. Because there's the intersection of climate and tradition and culture, but there's also the inflection of Western influence. And by that, I mean that having access to skiffs and engines that you can motor them with, and then the petrol that makes them go, is slowly transforming what for literally millennia has been dependent on a dog sled culture. So there's certainly a convenience aspect for them to be able to, say, hunt narwhal with a boat as opposed to standing at the edge of the sea ice with their dog sleds and whatnot. So yes, of course, they see it. Is it inconvenient to them? That poetically, as from the West, we'd like to say, of course it is, but that's mostly the way that we perceive it. For them, it may find just more convenience because of this inflection point in Western influence.
I mean, do they worry much about, as well, what effect on their own lives various machinations further away may have? This idea, which is what we're going to get into more in this episode, of the Arctic becoming an even more openly contested space than it now is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the point I was trying to make is that they have accustomed themselves and, in fact, dependent on their survival skills and their ability to adapt to an incredibly antagonistic environment. That same, adaptive skill is applied to as this environment is transforming. Now, don't get me wrong, that's also affecting the biodiversity, and it's moving the biomass in various directions, which is affecting their ability to capture it and, hunt it as a means of sustenance. But the reality is that they're opportunistic in the way that circumstances present themselves. And if you were indeed going towards the geopolitical aspect of, what that land represents to either Danish interests or potentially US interests, I would say that they're relatively agnostic to that as well. It's primarily about opportunity.
I just want to ask finally, partly because looking at your photos does make me somewhat jealous as someone who's been north-ish. I've been as far as Grimsey Island off the north of Iceland and to the northern Gulf of Bothnia in Finland, but I've never done proper Arctic. Would you recommend it to people, and if so, why?
Well, yeah, of course. It's amazing. First of all, because it's really important, I think, to understand the dimension of this environment as it influences the rest of the world. So people often say that the poles are the air conditioner of the world, and that's really true. But more than that, I think it's just to understand that we are emotionally connected to this environment, and it could be said that the real crisis that we're facing presently with climate change is not necessarily our capacity to know and understand, but our capacity to feel. And when you go there, I don't mean to feel the cold, but to feel the emotion of this grand theater that expands itself in the very northernmost and very southernmost latitudes, something that once again is akin to being on another planet.
That was Sebastian Copeland, photographer and polar explorer. To look at some of Sebastian's work, pick up a copy of his book, Polar Explorations, to the Ends of the Earth. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, and for the winter edition of Monocle's sister title, Confect, The Foreign Desk helped bring together a group of Nordic experts to discuss over lunch the increasing geopolitical significance of the Arctic. Following that lunch, the Foreign Desk's producer, Anita Riota, sat down with two of the guests, both senior researchers from the Danish Institute for International Studies Foreign Policy and Diplomacy Department. Jessica Larsen specialises in maritime security, and Rasmus Sinding Sondergaard in US foreign policy. Anita began by asking Rasmus about Denmark's role as a gatekeeper to the Baltic during the Cold War.
Unlike what we see today, during the Cold War, Denmark was what one considered a frontline state in the Cold War. That is because we didn't have other NATO members further east. Denmark was, you could say, hypothetically the arena of the fighting in the case of a hot war to break out between the West and the Eastern Bloc. So therefore, the sort of prospect of war between East and West was very real in Denmark, because Denmark was, like I said, a frontline state. And so that did something to the mentality around it, which is why we were much better mentally prepared back then for the sort of prospect of fighting. Whereas today, Denmark is not a frontline state, but a sort of transit area in a hypothetical war between Russia and the West, where now the Baltic states have taken over that role of being the frontline state.
To bring us then to current day, Jessica, what is the largest maritime threat in your view facing Denmark?
Well, as I was talking about earlier, the freedom of navigation is foundational to Danish security, but also Danish economy. And therefore, Denmark has been a very active state in all the operational theaters where the freedom of navigation was at stake. So from piracy to the Houthis. And of course, now the threats are moving closer to home with cable cuts, shadow fleets, and so on. So now, we have to fight on multiple fronts.
I did actually want to ask you, how much of a menace do you see Russia's so-called ghost fleet being?
It's a huge issue because the Shadow Fleet is feeding the Russian war machine despite sanction package after sanction package coming out of Brussels and the EU, but also the UK and the US. Of course, it's having some effect in terms of curbing Russian revenue coming from oil, but it's still not enough.
And do you think that this threat is being taken seriously enough? Is enough being done to address it, tackle it?
Yes, I think all policymakers understand the seriousness of it and know enough is not being done, if that's a way to formulate it. What we need in Europe is to stop buying Russian energy, full stop. And I know that's easier said than done.
As Trump would tell you.
Yeah.
What Trump says.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to ask you then, sort of bringing Trump into the equation. Is Denmark bemused, frightened? What would you call it by the actual threat of the U.S. seizing Greenland? Where does that live in the psyche?
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone here in Copenhagen or in Denmark that's bemused by it, let alone in Greenland, where I think they're even more upset about it. So maybe that's not the way to put it. As a side note, when there was an opinion poll made across Europe ahead of the U.S. election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and Denmark was the country in Europe with the greatest preference for Kamala Harris. So it tells you a little bit about what you need to know about the Danish perspective on Trump, sort of in general. And then when you throw Greenland into the mix and add that sort of what is perceived in Denmark as a threat to the territorial integrity of the Danish realm, of the Danish royal kingdom, then of course people are even more concerned. So I would say that most Danes shake their head when they hear Trump make some of those statements, but underneath that there's also a very real concern, and I think we've learned to take him seriously with some of these remarks, and so people are definitely not bemused, but rather quite disturbed.
What steps can be taken to sort of ward off against this? Do you think we were to sort of allude to our other conversation, our conflict conversation, we were discussing how actually the U.S. can be pulled either to the east or the west, and is this flashpoint over Greenland, could there actually be collaboration that comes out of it?
I mean, I won't rule it out. And given that the U.S. historically have had a keen interest in Greenland, both from a security but also economic perspective, I guess in theory you could envision that increased cooperation between Greenland, Denmark, and the United States could be an avenue for sort of closer cooperation. But at the moment, at least, it seems that Greenland is very much a source of conflict rather than cooperation. So for the moment, I don't see it as a positive. I also want to add that in Danish foreign policy, this is what some of my colleagues debate this very intensely. We have this concept of the Greenland card. Like Trump, when he talks about geopolitics, likes to talk about how you do not have the cards, as he told Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, Denmark has supposedly historically had this Greenland card, which was the understanding is that because of Danish control over Greenland, and that of course has changed a bit over the years, but because of Greenland being part of the Danish realm, that has given us leverage in Washington. That's how the story goes. Well, now it seems that maybe the fact that Greenland is part of the Danish realm is not giving us leverage, but is a risk for Danish relations. And there's all this speculation about what might a conflict over Greenland mean for Danish-American relations more broadly? Will that have negative consequences for the U.S.'s commitment to our security? Will it have consequences for Danish companies operating in the U.S.? Will they be singled out for sanctions?
I want to ask you, Jessica, about that theme of collaboration and cooperation. What do you make of the state of European maritime collaboration and maybe even expanding to a more international scale?
Well, as we also were discussing over lunch, there's definitely heightened attention and heightened activity around European collaboration around security and defense. I still think we have a challenge in terms of getting to terms with what the threat is, and that is going to be the case always because we have different geographies, but it doesn't necessarily hamper our ability to cooperate. And there can be different paths within a European context in terms of collaborating. Also, like Nordefco is stepping up to deal with the northern security, other actors in the Arctic region, and so on.
A final question to you both. For our listeners, what would you say from your fields is the thing, the dynamic, the story, big or small, that they should really keep their eye on?
So to give you a specific, I and many others have been keenly awaiting the U.S. Force Posture Review. And that is sort of the U.S. military's assessment of where should the U.S. troops be going forward. And so the reason why I've been awaiting this is that speculation has been that Trump would dramatically reduce American military presence in Europe. And that Force Posture Review is due to come out in the fall. The same thing is, by the way, the U.S. National Security Strategy. That one's also on the way. So keep an eye out for where's the troops going? Are the U.S. pulling troops out of Europe or not? And what's in the National Security Strategy? Is it still centered on China? Or are we looking at something else where they might be more focused on their own hemisphere, as I understand some people anticipate? And will that focus on the hemisphere include a greater focus on Greenland?
From a maritime perspective, I'm very eager to know what's going to come out of the working group that was established after the NATO summit in January, where Baltic states legal experts from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs got together and started looking into how they can deal with cable cuts and the shadow fleet. And of course, this pertains to a Baltic region, but it can be it can be applied in other places. And the reason it's so important is because they're actually talking about a more dynamic interpretation of international law, dynamic interpretation of the law of the sea, which will have huge consequences if they go ahead with it. I am very curious to see what comes out of it, because it will create precedents in other parts of the world. And as a maritime nation, that has consequences.
That was Jessica Larsen, expert in maritime security, and Rasmus Sinding Sondergaard, expert in US foreign policy, both of the Danish Institute for International Studies, speaking to Foreign Desk producer Anita Riota in Copenhagen. Their conversation can be read in full in the new edition of Confect on a newsstand near you now. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio, and joining us finally is Eero Saka, Senior Research Fellow in the Research Programme for Finnish Foreign Policy, Northern European Security and NATO at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Eero, first of all, and perhaps a slightly leading question, is NATO currently paying as much attention to the Arctic as it should be?
Well, I mean, if you look at the Arctic region and NATO's positioning towards the Arctic region, I mean, it became one of the forgotten flanks during the post-Cold War years after the collapse of the USSR. During the Cold War era, there was a strategic importance for NATO to look after the area because of the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, UK gap, for instance. So what we see now is basically, because of so many things changing, the melting of the permafrost and rare earth minerals and other metals coming more available, we see an increased great power rivalry between the US, Russia and China. We see basically new opportunities in terms of shipping routes from the Indo-Pacific region to the Arctic region. And we see also increased military activity in the region. So what NATO should be doing, and I think is taking little steps towards that direction, is basically emphasizing the importance of the Arctic area, the high north, as no longer as being the forgotten flank, but becoming an increasingly important part of NATO's military planning. But having said that, I think there's a lot more to be done. Since we have now 7 out of 8 of the Arctic states, Finland and Sweden also members of NATO, what NATO could do, obviously, is to intensify military planning in the region amongst those Arctic 7 countries. So the challenge obviously is how to do that, how to maintain a thorough situational awareness of this geographically vast area and region, how to perform these multi-domain operations in all of the different environments in this very challenging, mostly uninhabited environment with extremely cold climate conditions. But I think NATO is taking the right steps towards that.
I mean, on that thought, we'll talk about some of those specific steps shortly, but on that broader thought that 7 of the 8 immediately Arctic nations are now NATO countries since Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, do we have to assume an end to what used to be called Arctic exceptionalism? There used to be this idea that whatever other disagreements Russia had with the West, we could all get along where the Arctic was concerned. Do we now have to assume that Russia has to be considered an adversary in the Arctic as well?
Well, unfortunately, it looks like that. I mean, what we see is an increased military activity and military interests from the Russian side as well to the region. And the Arctic Council that used to function for many, many years has been basically dormant for now since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And because of these increased tensions in many ways in the region, I think, unfortunately, even though cooperation would be the ideal situation, we are not seeing that. And we are seeing increased rivalry between the global West countries and the global East countries. So I think cooperation should be the way forward, but it's not looking like that now. And I think it would be in NATO's best interest, or NATO countries' best interest, to basically enforce a kind of deterrence by denial thinking in the region, even though we wouldn't like to necessarily securitize the Arctic, make it more military. I think that's what's happening at any rate. So I think we just have to be more pragmatic about it and make sure that our interests in our region is being protected.
You mentioned earlier steps that can be taken or are being taken or could be taken. Is it useful to think of the United States' recent agreement to buy as many as 11 icebreakers from Finland as encouraging in that respect? Does that seem like a step in the right direction?
I think it certainly is an encouraging sign, not only for Finland, but I think for the allied community. I mean, Finland is one of the icebreaking superpowers, you could say. Even though we are a small country, we have the second biggest icebreaker fleet in the world. And I think trying to find ways to cooperate amongst the NATO allies is a positive sign. Obviously, we have also seen signs that are not so positive when it comes to the allied partners' cooperation and behavior, let's say, in the last few months. The United States making claims, for instance, that it wants to buy Greenland is a very worrying sign, and certainly not increasing trust amongst the NATO countries. So I think the icebreaker deal is a very positive sign of how the NATO countries could bilaterally and even unilaterally in smaller groups reinforce their military cooperation.
I mean, just to follow that up, that point you were making about the United States' designs upon Greenland, how much more difficult does that make establishing some sort of coordinated plan for NATO in the Arctic if Denmark is having to think, well, do we also have to guard against the prospect of invasion by the United States?
Yes, it makes it very difficult. And I think there's a complete lack of trust currently between the United States and the Nordic countries when it comes to the question of Greenland, for instance. I mean, President Trump's claims over the territorial control over Greenland basically are against the wishes and will of the Greenlanders as well. So I don't think that's the way to do it, even though the United States probably have some strategic ambitions behind that. They want to lead the game and have the upper hand on the regional security questions in the Arctic, whether it's in terms of geoeconomic interests, such as the rare earth minerals, or geopolitical ones, such as countering increased military activity by China and Russia. But the way to do it this way, it's not going to work out. And as we all know, Greenland is part of the Danish kingdom as a self-governing country within that at the moment. And whether it would wish to gain a full sovereignty from Denmark is up to the Greenlanders to decide.
I mean, we've talked so far about this essentially being a contest between NATO and Russia over the Arctic, but is there a possibility that it might not be contained within the Arctic Circle? Does NATO have to start thinking in terms of how to position itself towards China, which is also taking an interest in the Arctic?
Indeed, this is an excellent question. So if we look at the Arctic, like I said, we see the United States being increasingly interested geoeconomically in the region. Russia for military reasons, but also geoeconomic ones. But if you look at China, China is the one that's kind of pivoting towards that direction. The difference between Russia and China, I think it's twofold when it comes to the role and positioning. Russia actually is an Arctic state, so it has legitimate rights to the region as well. It has one of the world's longest Arctic coastlines and is still a member of the Arctic Council, whereas China is not an Arctic country per se. It really treats the Arctic more as global commons, which really clashes with Moscow's territorial approach, and claims to be a near-Arctic state. So secondly, I would say that even though Russia's and China's interests in the Arctic are to a certain extent aligned, they have this idea of partnership, which is more really pragmatic than unified in their nature. China focuses more on trade and shipping, the economic benefits, the polar route, scientific discoveries in the region. So for China, it is really a secondary theatre. It's mostly important for trade routes and the kind of prestige it might gain in the global scale.
Iiro Saka, Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thanks for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.